Hello, everyone. So today I actually want to kind of continue on the theme of talking about the book project that I'm working on, and this is going to be kind of applying one of the main things I'm arguing in the book to the nature of faith. So that kind of fits, right? Because faith is also something I work on. So the way I want to kind of start is actually with a puzzle. It's a pretty basic puzzle. Some of you will probably already be familiar with it. And some people, I think, I set this up in my own words, but something like this, I think, is what a lot of people think sort of describes what you might call the problem of faith and reason or the problem of faith and evidence. So here's a way of sort of looking at that, and that this is basically going to be a trilemma, and each of these things are going to be, I think, to an extent plausible, but you can't embrace all three at the same time. Okay, so the first is that faith can be epistemically rational. I think this is plausible because I think faith is an important part of a flourishing life. Like I say a lot, I think faith is an important part of keeping our commitments, not just our religious commitments, but faith is important to things like friendship and marriage and committing, following through on our certain life projects, like goals, like long-term goals we have, that kind of thing. So I think because of the way faith helps us keep our commitments over time, faith can be epistemically rational. Not that it always is, but it can be. Okay. The second thing that I think is plausible is that faith goes beyond the evidence. And I think there's something intuitive behind this in the way that we even use the word faith in everyday language. I think some people obviously can take this too far. There's a difference between going beyond and going against the evidence. I wouldn't say faith goes against the evidence, but I would say that faith's relationship to evidence, it's just not straightforward. So if faith was just this thing that was always perfectly proportioned to the evidence, I think that would be a little bit odd or surprising. And related to this, part of what I think the function or role of faith is that it can help us keep our commitments in light of counter evidence. So we make a commitment and then we get evidence that we shouldn't have made that commitment. Part of what I think faith can do is help us keep our commitment even in light of evidence that makes us sort of question that commitment. And again, not in light of any amount of evidence. So it's not just like you keep your commitment no matter what evidence you get. But I do think faith is to a degree resilient in light of counter evidence. So because of these things, I think it's plausible that faith goes beyond the evidence. And then the third piece of the triad that I think seems somewhat plausible is that no epistemically rational attitude goes beyond the evidence. And I think a lot of people would have the intuition that this falls out of evidentialism. Evidentialism is the view that what epistemic rationality amounts to, it's a matter of following one's evidence, and it does sort of seem puzzling. Like, how can an attitude that goes beyond what our current evidence is or supports, how can an attitude go beyond that and still be rational? And that's actually what I want to kind of shed light on today. But what I want to do first is sort of set a couple solutions aside that I think are not as promising as the one I'm going to provide. But yeah, spoiler alert, I'm ultimately going to, I think, give us, I think, a pretty good reason to deny this third statement in the puzzle. Okay, so I want to set aside people that deny one. So there are people that think faith cannot be epistemically rational. So faith is always irrational. The first is what I call faith haters. So, people like the new atheists, some people on the internet are like this. They just say, faith is always irrational. Faith, is this thing that none of us should ever try to have. And I just kind of want to set that aside. I think a lot of times they're actually using the word faith in a different way than what like philosophers mean. But yeah, that's not really going to be what I'm focusing on arguing against today, but I'm happy to say more about what I would say about that a different time. And there's also kind of an interesting view called fideism. Fideism is the view that faith is irrational, but that's a good thing. And that's sometimes some people even think that's part of what makes faith good, is that it's irrational. I don't agree with that. So I'm also just gonna set that view aside, but I will say that my view is that faith is like belief. I think sometimes faith is rational and sometimes it's irrational. And to say that it's always irrational, I think goes too far. But you shouldn't also say that faith is always rational. Faith can be irrational too. Okay. The second answer I want to set aside is um, you can do kind of like a weird scope thing. So the first piece of the puzzle says that faith can be epistemically rational, and then you could modify to and say, well, faith sometimes goes beyond the evidence. But the only cases where faith is rational is the cases where it doesn't go beyond the evidence. So technically, if you divide faith into two cases, cases where it goes beyond the evidence, and then cases where it's rational, that is actually technically a way to solve the puzzle. And I think all faith at least involves a disposition to go beyond the evidence. And so the way I would sort of set this up, that wouldn't be possible. But I don't really think this is a plausible way to go, because it is kind of just like saying, yeah, like faith just doesn't go beyond the evidence, at least when it's rational. That's not really an interesting or satisfactory way, at least I want to solve the puzzle. And I do think going beyond the evidence is sort of part of what helps us keep our commitments over time, part of what keeps us stable when we encounter challenges. So it would be odd if that sort of key feature of faith, helping us keep our commitments over time, was also irrational. So I really want to hone in on the question of whether faith could be rational and go beyond the evidence at the same time, and kind of set aside people that deny one, especially. That said, I want to look at two views of faith that have actually been presented in the philosophy literature. Not that some versions of the two, like there are philosophers that defend fideism, for example, but I want to look at some that have been presented in the philosophy literature and talk a little bit more. I don't want to just set those aside, but kind of argue against those. So now on section 2, the first is the view that faith is a testimonial belief. Okay, so some people have defended this. It actually goes back quite a ways in the history of philosophy. There's at least roots of it in people like Aquinas and Locke and Augustine. But more recently, Anscombe and Zagzebski have suggested something like this. The idea is that faith is a belief or an attitude that's based on someone else's testimony. So when let's say you tell me you'll pick me up at the airport, and I trust your testimony, I take your word for it, then that could be an instance of faith that you'll pick me up at the airport, or faith in you, for example. And then maybe that's demonstrated by me waiting at the airport for you and not just calling a taxi or something, right? So the idea is that because testimony is an important source of evidence, which I think is true, faith is then based on evidence, and thus it is rational. So this is actually a way of denying too, I think. Faith doesn't go beyond the evidence because it's just based on testimony. So kind of in a way it's like straightforwardly proportionate to the evidence. You might also think this could apply to like religious faith. So maybe religious faith is based on like God's testimony or the testimony of religious leaders, something like that. And I'll say this, like both this one and the next proposed solution, I think get something right. I don't totally think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater and say both these solutions suck. So I do think faith and testimony are connected. But I don't think this can capture how faith sort of distinctively goes beyond the evidence. And, I'm not even sure that Anscombe and Zagzebski are intending to necessarily capture that, so I want to be fair to them. But if you offer this as a solution to sort of this puzzle of faith and reason, I'm not convinced. And I guess here's a few reasons. So on this view, what is faith? Well, it's basically just a testimonial belief. And again, testimony is an important source of evidence, so faith is just sort of straightforwardly proportional to the evidence. And I don't think this really tells us, like, what is unique about faith's relationship to the evidence? What's distinctive about faith? Why is there even seem to be a puzzle here in the first place? So I don't know that it captures kind of the distinct feature of faith or the unique relationship between faith and evidence. So even if faith and testimony are importantly connected, I just don't know that this is going to tell the full story. I think something is missing here. I also think it's important to note, like we said, faith can be resilient in light of counter evidence, but if faith is just perfectly proportioned to testimony, how can it explain faith's resilience in light of counter evidence? What does that look like? So I think it's hard to tell a story, especially if you're going to be denying two, about faith's resilience. So I actually think 2 is not the one to deny. I think 3 is the one to deny. Okay, so our second proposed solution actually does deny 3, but I don't, again, think it's going to give us the full story or the full answer here. Okay, so this solution says, well, faith is more of an action. And so the idea is that faith goes beyond the evidence in the sense that it can be rational to act as if something is true, even if you have strong evidence that it's false. So there's a few people I cited, McCoy and Dormandy, that defend this. Dormandy talks about what she calls desperate leap situations. So this is taken from her, not exactly the details are maybe the same as her case, but this is roughly her case. The aunt is, my aunt's on her deathbed, and I really want to see her, but I just don't have any way to get to her except for your offer to pick me up and drive me to the hospital. I think there's a chance you've come through, but I know you have been unreliable in the past to pick me up. But the thought is, maybe I shouldn't believe that you'll pick me up. Maybe I even think the probability you'll pick me up is under 50%. But it can be rational for me to act as if you'll pick me up and, coordinate a ride with you and wait for you and all of that. Because really, when you just kind of look at the cost benefit analysis, if that's my only way to get to the hospital to see my aunt who's dying, then that can just, that's the action that's rational to take, even in light of me thinking the probability you'll pick me up is less than 50%, or even if I disbelieve you'll pick me up. So that's why it's called a desperate leap, because I'm kind of desperate. It's the only way I can get to see my aunt, who's on her deathbed. And there's a number of cases like this, and I've actually utilized them in previous work. I talked about a case where your brother's missing, and the evidence that he is dead is getting more and more. It's kind of mounting, and it's still rational for you to go out and search for him, even if you think there's less than 50% chance that he's still alive. And in some cases, even if you think he's dead, as long as there's a chance he's still alive, at least to a degree, can be rational for you to continue to search for your brother. So I agree with the idea that, yeah, it can be rational to act as if something is true, even if you have strong evidence that it's false. But I don't think, again, this is actually going to be a full solution to this puzzle of faith and reason. So one point here is that this is kind of uncontroversial, at least among philosophers who are kind of familiar with decision theory. And that's not, of course, a problem for the VO, but it is kind of a basic point in a sense. Just if you know decision theory, this is just true. I think maybe more importantly, it's not clear how faith as a mental state is going beyond the evidence. So I think you can act in faithful ways, and faith can be an action, but I also think faith is a thing in your head. And I'm interested in how can faith as a mental state, maybe something that has belief and desire like components, for example, how does that go beyond the evidence? And I don't think this gives us really an answer to that. And also, relatedly, I don't think it's clear that this means that faith would be epistemically rational. It's about action, and it's more about practical rationality, like what should you do in light of the fact that your aunt's on her deathbed and I'm the only chance you have to go see her. So I want a view that concerns faith as a mental state, and I want a view that is about epistemic rationality that's not about general rationality or practical rationality. So putting all this together, I guess I don't think it's too hard, especially if you're kind of already on board with the decision theory in the background, to show that you can rationally act against the evidence. I think that's a clear point. But showing how it's epistemically rational for attitude-focused faith to go beyond the evidence, I think that's a harder challenge, but I also think it's a more interesting challenge, and that's the challenge I sort of want to tackle here. So hopefully you can see that, I think both of these solutions are interesting and important parts of faith, but I don't know that they're going to tell us this full story. Okay, so we're going to move to my proposal, starting with a little bit of background and kind of the epistemology. And if you watch some of my other videos or the video about the book I'm working on, this might be familiar, but I want to kind of back up. Remember, we're talking about the puzzle of faith and evidence, right? How does faith relate to evidence? How does faith go beyond the evidence and still be rational? And I think to solve this, I think we should note something about the nature of evidence itself. And that's, I don't think that just having evidence or possessing evidence, I don't think that's going to be solving all of our epistemic problems. So evidence can be limited. Evidence can be complicated. Evidence can be misleading. I think most people that working in epistemology acknowledge all these things. And even if we do our very best to follow our evidence, we think about our evidence a lot, we really try to follow it faithfully, I actually don't think it's always going to be straightforward what we should believe or what we should conclude. Okay, so this is a way of denying three. Again, no epistemically rational attitude goes beyond the evidence, because I think epistemically rational attitudes do go beyond the evidence. So the background sort of theory here is what's known as epistemic permissivism. And epistemic permissivism is the view that sometimes the evidence rationally permits more than one belief attitude towards a proposition. This is at least epistemic permissivism about belief. That's the one I'm focusing on today. And I think if you go in for the kind of permissivism I'm thinking about, another way of putting that is that there are epistemic ties. So two attitudes are going to be epistemically tied, if and only if they're kind of epistemically on a par, given the evidence. So the evidence doesn't really tell us to pick one over the other. And I think these ties can be intrapersonal, so involving a single person. Two attitudes can be tied for a person. And then synchronic, so at a time, not just necessarily over time. Even if my evidence is the same, I could change my view, but I think at a time, two different attitudes could be live for me. Either one could be rational given my evidence. And so we have, the three belief attitudes: belief, withholding, and disbelief. I think these ties can be moderate, so they can just involve belief and withholding, or just involve disbelief and withholding. Or I think they could be extreme. So I actually think they can involve belief, withholding, and disbelief. Okay, so I think I've maybe talked about some of these examples already on here, but just as a refresher, here's some examples of what I think this would look like. You've seen Making of a Murderer. This will sound familiar. So you're a part of a jury on a murder trial. You're trying to decide if Stephen is guilty, and you think there's a decent case to be made that Stephen did it based on sort of the eyewitness testimony. But there's also the evidence that this eyewitness was manipulated. There's some evidence that the people interviewing the eyewitness just kind of planted things that then the eyewitness said that they saw. And the local police, who also did the interviewing, have a clear motive to frame Stephen for this murder. That said, framing Stephen would have required very careful work. So human bone fragments were found in Stephen's backyard, and Stephen's DNA was found on the victim's car. So again, right, evidence is complicated, it's misleading, it's limited, not clear what to conclude here. Furthermore, there's another serial killer who's a prime suspect. And the victim, the person who was murdered, does fit the serial killer's profile, and there's some evidence that serial killer was in the area at the time. So wow, if you've seen Making of a Murderer, you might be relating to this. Like, I was just like all over the place when I was watching this. I still don't know what I think about this. But I think in a lot of cases, people can have the same evidence, and it can be rational, holding that evidence fixed for them to believe that Stephen is guilty, to withhold belief, or to believe the other serial killer did it, and to believe that Stephen is innocent. So all three belief attitudes can be rational for a person, given this complicated, misleading, limited body of evidence. Possibly misleading. I mean, some of the evidence is going to be misleading because it's pointing in different directions, right? Okay, so that's one example. Another example, kind of a different flavor, but one I think is interesting, is let's say you're getting your eyes tested at the doctor's office. So the top couple of lines you can easily read. There's a big E at the top. Then there's the bottom couple lines, complete blur. No clue what any of those letters say. You read down the chart, and at a certain point, maybe near the middle of the chart, you can mostly make out the letters. But for some of the letters, you sort of have doubts about whether you're saying them correctly. Like, is that a D or is that a P? And the thought is that at some point in the middle of the chart, you're going to be rationally allowed to form beliefs about what those letters are, but you have enough doubt and they're blurry enough that you can also withhold belief and be perfectly rational as well. I call these style of arguments evidence trickle arguments, because they're cases where your evidence starts off really good, ends up really bad, or vice versa. It could start off really bad, end up really good. The thought is that somewhere in this spectrum, you're going to be able to both believe and withhold belief. Both of those are going to be rationally available to you. So again, intrapersonal, synchronic, this would be a case of moderate permissivism. Okay, the final case, and a case that I think is interesting when we're thinking about faith, and especially religious faith, is a case of belief in God. And this is actually, I love this case because it's from Peter Van Inwagen's actually autobiography about him coming to believe in God. I use this case a lot, maybe too much, but I think it's really cool. And he says that he remembers having a picture of the cosmos, the physical universe, as a self-subsistent thing. So it was just there, it didn't require any explanation. And he says he could even have this like mental image that came to mind, and it just represents the whole cosmos as self-subsistent. Then he can call the same image to mind, but and it still represents the whole cosmos, but now there's this felt conviction that it's not self-subsistent, but it depends on something else, something that's not represented in any feature of the image, but something that's radically different from what the image represents. That's God. Yeah, in case it wasn't obvious. So so we have this world, this cosmos that's uncreated, independent, existing by itself, and then this world or cosmos that's created and dependent on its creator, dependent on God. And he says he actually had a period of transition where he could move back and forth, he literally says, at will, in a duck rabbit fashion, between experiencing the image as self-subsistent and experiencing it as dependent. And I think that's so interesting. But that is, again, this intrapersonal syncrotic. This would be an extreme kind of permissivism, because he says he can move between kind of like this perspective of disbelieving to this perspective of believing, these two different representations of the world. And I think a really, really interesting way. So not claiming all of us can do this with our beliefs about God at any time, but I do think especially for those of us who maybe had more slow conversions, who kind of came to believe in God or disbelieve, right, over time, I think a lot of times we can relate to this. We can say, yeah, there's a period where I was kind of going back and forth. And oftentimes we'll eventually settle on one perspective or another, or maybe even agnosticism. But I do think in the midst of a conversion experience, this kind of experience is actually more common than people might think. Okay, so those are some examples of the kind of permissivism that I'm thinking of. And I want to kind of bring this back to faith. So here's the thought. The thought is that faith breaks these epistemic ties. When two or more attitudes are epistemically kind of on a par for us, so the evidence doesn't tell us to believe one or believe other, but both are rational given our evidence, you can demonstrate an attitude-based faith by choosing the more faithful attitude. Okay, so some examples of this. The case that we just talked about, choosing to be a theist, I think could be one. You're kind of in this case where you're, in between theism and atheism, and you're kind of going back and forth, and you can really see the world in either way. Both can be rational given your evidence. Then I think you could break that tie by choosing to take the more faithful attitude. In this case, it would be the one that demonstrates religious or theistic faith. It could be also when choosing like which religion to believe or which religious doctrine to hold. I think that could be an example of this as well. And also another example of this, it's what's known as epistemic partiality, but this is when we're forming beliefs about our family and friends. So, you could the murder example, but maybe it's your family member involved and you choose to believe they're innocent in the midst of conflicting evidence that sort of rationalizes belief, withholding, and disbelief. Or it could only rationalize two of those. It could rationalize withholding and belief, for example. You choose to take the more faithful attitude, the attitude that represents like loyalty and trust in them, um, when they're kind of accused of this crime. Something similar in marriage, and there can even be really mundane cases of this, like your spouse does something, and you can either interpret them as having really like malicious motives with it, or be like, they just forgot, or like there's some more charitable explanation. They're really stressed out right now, whatever. Um, again, the evidence might underdetermine which interpretation of their actions you should take, and faith can break that epistemic tie. You can choose the more faithful attitude rather than maybe, let's say, the one that paints them in a bad light. Okay. That said, and I want to thank Catherine Dormany for pushing me on this because I think it's a really good point. The question of what is the more faithful attitude is a hard one, and one that I don't necessarily want to take a firm stance on, at least for every case. Because what the more faithful attitude is going to involve is it's going to involve sort of considerations about non-epistemic values. So the sort of question like what attitude is best to have all things considered, which could include pragmatic or practical value, moral value, relational value, and social value, etc., etc., right? So I do think certain belief attitudes may align better with our commitments, whether that's a commitment, a religious commitment you have, or a marriage or a friendship, for example. But I also think this doesn't always necessarily mean believing the best of others. And I think it often can, but I think maybe like there's a case where you need to believe something negative about someone to help them. And yeah, like in a sense, it would be better to leave the positive thing, and maybe you're in a tie case, but then it's like, well, maybe the stakes are actually really high with respect to you choosing to believe the positive thing, because if you choose to believe that, you won't be motivated to help them in the same way. And if you choose to believe like, no, they're actually really struggling and they need help, or they actually really did do this bad thing, then you can kind of step in and get them the help they need. And so you really do need to think about all the relevant values and not just sort of say the more faithful attitude equals believing the best. So determining the more faithful attitude, it might not always be straightforward. There could probably be a whole other paper just on that question. But I will say that it's complicated and it requires weighing up a lot of different kinds of non-epistemic values. Okay, so I want to say a little bit about motivating my proposal and then just close with some reflections on the extent to which faith might be voluntary here. Okay, so the first thing I think is cool about my proposal is I think it pretty straightforwardly solves our trilemma. So faith can be epistemically rational in a way almost by definition on this picture. What we're sort of building in or presupposing is that these are permissive cases. So the attitudes in question are all rationally permissible given your evidence, and the evidence is going to get the first say, right? So if your evidence says, well, you can believe or withhold, and you disbelieve, well, that's going to not be rational faith, right? So you're going to have to pick one of the attitudes that's permitted, but when you do that, your attitude will be rational, again, almost by definition. So that's cool. But at the same time, an epistemically rational attitude can go beyond the evidence, because the evidence leaves open the attitude that you should adopt. So again, in these permissive cases, you can stare at the evidence all day, but it's not going to tell you to pick one attitude over the other. And what tells us to pick one attitude over the other is sort of looking beyond the epistemic to looking to these other values, and these other values can then help us determine which attitude to adopt. Okay, so I think that's a really important virtue of the proposal, is that I think it solves our trilemma really nicely. We can even go back up very quickly. So this is true, faith can be epistemically rational. This is true, faith goes beyond the evidence. And this is false, no epistemically rationality goes beyond the evidence. Okay, moving on. I also think there's other virtues of this solution. So related, but I think slightly distinct. This view is consistent with evidentialism, right? At least, I mean, of course, there's different ways to interpret evidentialism, and I am letting practical and moral factors break epistemic ties. But my part of the point here is that you're never required to believe or hold an attitude going against the evidence. So evidence is going to kind of get the first pass, always, and it's consistent with at least versions of evidentialism that say, proportion your beliefs to the evidence, or, never believe against the evidence. Exactly. I 100% agree. That is true. Do not believe against the evidence. Faith doesn't require you to believe or hold attitudes that go against the evidence. Okay. It's also consistent, though, and I've kind of been slipping between faith and belief a little bit here, and I acknowledge that, but it is consistent with views on which faith doesn't require belief or doesn't entail belief. A lot of philosophers in the faith literature are defending those kinds of views, and I'm not going to take a strong stance on that here, but just to show that it's broadly consistent with that idea, you could have a case where you're trying, to determine whether P is true, and having an attitude focused faith that P, that's inconsistent with disbelieving P, but it could be consistent with withholding belief. And so you choose to kind of withhold belief. Your evidence is permissive rather than disbelief. I think, yeah, it's very possible you could have faith and demonstrate that by withholding belief rather than disbelieving. And you could even take a case like maybe making it a little more concrete, like your siblings accused of a crime and like the evidence against them is pretty good. And it probably would be epistemically rational for you to disbelieve, but you choose to withhold belief that they committed the crime. I think that could demonstrate attitude-based faith without belief, at least, in theory. And so I don't think this requires us to say that faith entails belief. Okay. It also can explain why faith kind of seems most crucial, or kind of seems to come into play in cases of inconclusive evidence, because those are kind of going to be a mark of permissive cases where our evidence doesn't firmly tell us to hold one attitude over another. And a number of, there's different ways that people put this, but, they say it seems weird to have cases of faith when your evidence is conclusive, or when certain, faith seems inconsistent with certainty, those kinds of things. And so I think this view could nicely explain why faith does seem to go hand in hand with kind of cases where evidence isn't conclusive. I think it can also capture the idea that faith involves risk, but this is kind of a unique kind of risk. It's like an attitude-based risk. So let's just take a case where your evidence allows you to disbelieve, withhold, or believe, and you choose to believe. You are taking a risk of getting a false belief, right? It's not like your evidence is conclusive. It's not like your evidence makes P certain, but you're risking getting a false belief for the potential benefit of getting at the truth. And this relates to this idea from William James. I think a lot of this actually is inspired by William James, I'll say that. William James I'm a fan, yeah. But he talks about our two epistemic goals, getting at the truth and avoiding error. And so the idea is that sometimes it's okay, it's good to take a risk to try to get at the truth, even if you're also risking getting a false belief. Because if you say we should just withhold on everything, it seems to be really ignoring this other epistemic goal we have, which is having true beliefs. So we do need to balance those two epistemic goals. And I think this way of thinking about faith can explain this sort of attitude-based risk that you can take sometimes by taking that leap and going ahead and believing. Okay. It can also, I think, explain faith's resilience to counter evidence, because part of the idea, the epistemic background, I guess, is that there are gaps or slack between evidence and rationality. So I think it's very plausible that you could gain or lose evidence and still continue to hold the permitted attitude. And that sort of contrasts with cases where there's sort of a strict determination between evidence and rationality. Okay, so one quick objection, and then I'm going to move to talking about how faith could be voluntary on this picture. So you might wonder, well, what about cases where evidence only rationalizes a single attitude? So can we have faith in these cases? So let's say my evidence like straightforwardly tells me to believe P and then I believe P. Okay, what do we see about these cases? Well, I think one thing that I actually think, although this will be controversial, I actually think these cases of epistemic ties are decently common. Yes, of course, there's going to be 1 + 1 = 2. I'm required to believe that there's an even number of stars. I'm required to withhold belief, right? So you can come up with these cases where evidence does seem to rationalize a single attitude. But I think there's a lot of cases, and especially cases that are kind of going to be ones that are candidates for faith, that are going to be cases where there are epistemic ties. And one thing, there's an interesting paper by Nelson called "We Don't Have Positive Epistemic Duties" or something like that. And the idea is that like withholding is actually often permitted. We can kind of come to think about the possibility of error even for evidence is really good. And so Nelson actually thinks that we don't have a positive epistemic duty to believe anything. I don't know if I want to go that far, but I do think withholding is actually can be often permitted, especially depending on how you're kind of weighing these Jamesian goals. I also think there can often be multiple good but mutually exclusive explanations of the evidence when we're kind of thinking through like these tough cases. And so I think, yeah, maybe there is cases where evidence rationalizes a single attitude, but I think those cases are actually going to be more rare than some people think. And I think often, especially cases of faith, are going to be ones where there are epistemic ties. That said, in the no tie cases, so the cases where there's one rational attitude given our evidence, I think you can still be disposed to continue to hold a faithful attitude, like if you received counter evidence, and that can be a way of having faith. And you know, all that's to say, I think action-focused faith, at the very least, can go beyond the evidence in these cases in the way that was described by Dormandy and McCoyne. So I don't, again, think that account is wrong. I just think it's incomplete. It doesn't tell us about epistemic rationality or attitudes. But even if you think, well, here's a case where your evidence clearly rationalizes a single attitude, you could still demonstrate action-focused faith in those cases. So that said, I think the paradigm cases of faith are going to be ones involving inconclusive evidence. And I think when you think about like all the things you ought to believe, well, those aren't necessarily all just things that you have faith are true, because faith involves kind of desire and commitment, and it might even be like things that are a little more important to us, kind of at the core of kind of who we are and what we're committed to. And so there might be a sense in which those, you shouldn't just think about all the things you believe when we're thinking about this, but think about those kinds of propositions. So hopefully that helps with that worry, like how common are these permissive cases or whatever. I want to now kind of make good on the title. So I called the title Faith Voluntary and Rational. And just for the sake of time, I don't know that I can fully defend the voluntariness of faith here, but I do want to say a couple things. Okay. Actually, let me scroll down. There we go. Okay. So doxastic voluntarism, the view that we have voluntary control over our beliefs, is actually not super popular. Doxastic involuntarism, so we don't have voluntary control over our beliefs, that is a much more popular view. Many people are arguing we don't have control over our beliefs, either because of conceptual reasons about the nature of belief or psychological reasons, kind of the makeup of our, you know, our brains, our psychology, right? But I do think, not everyone, but I think a lot of people in this literature are not really thinking about the right cases, because they'll say things like, well, look, beliefs aim at the truth, right? To believe something is to believe that it's true. And so if you really believe something voluntarily, if you choose to believe rather than withhold, or choose to believe rather than disbelieve, if you have genuine options about what to believe, that would require believing something that you take to be false. So, that's impossible. That's not belief. Beliefs aim at the truth. And I think they're just kind of like, in some cases, overlooking the possibility of permissive cases where there's multiple equally rational attitudes given your evidence, cases where the evidence is ambiguous. And so I think that permissive cases are going to be much more plausibly cases of belief as a genuine choice. So again, we can think about some examples like, 2 + 2 = 5. I can't just make myself believe that. And that's kind of like, I think they tend to give examples like that. Alston gives an example of like, make yourself believe the US is a colony of Great Britain. Yeah, I can't believe that, right? I can't, that's clearly false, right? um, or some things like, there's a desk in front of me. I don't know that I can just make myself disbelieve that. Some people would argue you can like work yourself up into doubting and then withhold, but we can set that aside. It's hard to change beliefs when they're obviously true or obviously false, right? But when we kind of move into a different realm and think about controversial issues, God's existence, who committed some crime, tough cases in ethics, politics, philosophy, right? Cases where we're torn between multiple equally good explanations of the evidence, I'm not seeing this beliefs aim at the truth. And so in holding an attitude, if you hold it voluntarily, you're going to have to take yourself to have a belief that you think is false, and that's impossible. I mean, and that's a little bit of a caricature. I'm not saying all the arguments are that simple, but I do think when you're kind of torn between two explanations of your evidence, or you see like, the evidence is really complicated and misleading, it's a lot less clear. You have an epistemic tie. Both attitudes are equally rational given your evidence. You don't know which one's true. I think it's way less clear. You can't just pick one. So what kind of control is this? Well, philosophers distinguish between different kinds of control. So there's direct control. That's kind of like hand-raising control. You can, you can do it just like that, right? I'm open to the idea that in some permissive cases, we could actually even have direct control and believe something, choose to believe just like that. I'm not going to defend that here. That's going to be really controversial, and a lot of people are going to be like, already really resistant to what I'm saying in general, and like there's no way I'm going to convince them of that. But I also don't think that having control to do something just like that is the only kind of control that's relevantly voluntary. And the really thing I want to think about is whether faith can be voluntary here. So that said, I think we have some kind of robust voluntary but maybe slightly more indirect control in permissive cases. And these are going to be cases where you're kind of reasoning about your evidence, reasoning about what to believe. You kind of realize you're in an epistemic tie, and then you come to take an attitude, even for possibly non-epistemic reasons. You could also take an attitude just by picking one, and it doesn't have to be for non-epistemic reasons. So I think both possibilities are there. But I think through kind of like a process of reasoning that's relatively short, and relatively like a reliable process, you can come to pick one attitude or another, and even like intend to believe and then reason yourself into that belief, for example. And I think, so to give analogous examples for action, this is kind of relevantly voluntary in the sense that things like washing the dishes, rearranging the furniture, writing a paper, or even writing a paragraph of a paper, going on a run. Like, we have voluntary control over these things. We can go do them, right? Like, of course, things can get in the way. There is a process involved, but relatively reliably, dishes can be washed. You can go on a run. You can put your shoes on. You know what I mean? And that's the kind of control I'm thinking of here that is maybe technically indirect in the sense that it's not just like that. But I don't think we need just like that control for an action to be voluntary, because all these actions we consider to be voluntary, we can't do just like that. They do take a little bit of time, maybe a couple hours, maybe a couple days, often the ones I'm thinking of are like a couple hours or less. But I do, so people will say, oh, that's not direct control, it's indirect control, whatever. But I think it's relevantly voluntary. So maybe another soapbox I won't get on right now is this obsession obsession that some people in this literature have with direct control. I just don't think it's necessary, because I don't think direct control is voluntary control. So anyways, let me just wrap this all up. The idea here is that in permissive cases, when we're torn between multiple good explanations of our evidence, when we encounter epistemic ties, not only do I think faith can be rational but go beyond the evidence, but I actually think we could have genuine voluntary control over what we believe. And I think that's interesting and important. And then maybe another desiderata for faith, because people will say, well, I can't control whether I have faith, or I can't, beliefs just happen to me. And I actually think sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. And I think that's an important thing to note here as well. So I think permissivism is cool, because not only does it kind of leave room for non-epistemic values to kind of come in and have a role to play, but I think it also leaves us with a kind of voluntary control over our beliefs that's more robust, and possibly one that I think some people are overlooking. Okay, so I've argued that rational faith breaks epistemic ties. This solves our trilemma. I think it pretty straightforwardly shows how faith can go beyond the evidence, and I think also has a number of other virtues, including making it plausible that faith is, at least in some sense, voluntary. Cool. That was long. If you made it to the end, that's awesome. Thanks for watching. I appreciate you listeners, appreciate your support.